Chapter 3 of Witching Hill by E.W. Hornung. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. A Vicious Circle. The Berridges of Berylstow, a house near my office in the Witching Hill Road, were perhaps the very worthiest family on the whole estate. Old Mr. Berridge, by a lifetime of faithful service, had risen to a fine position in one of the oldest and most substantial assurance societies in the city of London. Mrs. Berridge, herself a woman of energetic character, devoted every minute that she could spare from household duties, punctiliously fulfilled, to the glorification of the local vicar and the denunciation of modern ideas. There was a daughter whose name of Beryl had inspired that of the house. She was her mother's miniature and echo, and had no desire to ride a bicycle or do anything else that Mrs. Berridge had not done before her. An only son, Guy, completed the partie carrée, and already made an admirable accountant under his father's eagle eye. He was about 30 years of age, had a mild face but a fierce moustache, was engaged to be married, and already picking up books and pictures for the new home. As a bookman, Guy Berridge stood alone. "There's nothing like them for furnishing a house," said he, "and nowadays they're so cheap. There's that new edition of the Victorian classics, 1 and 10 halfpenny, and those 18th century masterpieces. I don't know when I shall get time to read them, but they're worth the money for the binding alone, especially with everything peculiar taken out." Peculiar was a family epithet of the widest possible significance. It was peculiar of Guy, in the eyes of the other three, to be in such a hurry to leave their comfortable home for one of his own on a necessarily much smaller scale. Miss Hemming, the future Mrs. Guy, was by no means deficient in peculiarity from his people's point of view. She affected flowing fabrics of peculiar shades, and she had still more peculiar ideas of furnishing. On Saturday afternoon she would drag poor Guy into all the second-hand furniture shops in the neighbourhood, not even to save money, as Mrs. Berridge complained to her more intimate friends, but just to be peculiar. It seemed like a judgment when Guy fell so ill with influenza, obviously contracted in one of those highly peculiar shops, that he had to mortgage his summer holiday by going away for a complete change early in the new year. He went to country cousins of the suburban Hemmings. His own Miss Hemming went with him, and it was on their return that a difference was first noticed in the young couple. They no longer looked radiant together, much less when apart. The good young accountant would pass my window with a quite tragic face, and one morning, when we met outside, he told me that he had not slept a wink. That evening I went to smoke a pipe with Uvo Delavoye, who happened to have brought me into these people's ken, and we were actually talking about Guy Berridge and his affairs when the maid showed him up into Uvo's room. I never saw a man look quite so wretched. The mild face seemed to cower behind the truculent moustache. The eyes, bright and bloodshot, winced when one met them. I got up to go, feeling instinctively that he had come to confide in Uvo. But Berridge read me as quickly as I read him. "Don't you go on my account," he said gloomily. "I've nothing to tell Delavoye that I can't tell you, especially after giving myself away to you once already to-day. I dare say 3 heads will be better than 2, and I know I can trust you both." "Is anything wrong?" asked Uvo, when preliminary solicitations had reminded me that his visitor neither smoked nor drank. "Everything," was the reply. "Not with your engagement, I hope?" "That's it," said Berridge, with his eyes on the carpet. "It isn't off?" "Not yet." "I don't want to ask any more than I ought," said Uvo after a pause, "but I always imagine that, between people who are engaged, the least little thing—" "It isn't a little thing," and the accountant shook his downcast head. "I only meant, my dear chap, if you'd had some disagreement—" We've never had the least little word." "Has she changed?" asked Uvo Delavoye. "Not that I know of," replied Berridge, but he looked up as though it were a new idea, and there was more life in his voice. "She'd tell you," said Uvo, "if I know her." "Do people tell each other?" eagerly inquired our friend. "They certainly ought, and I think Miss Hemming would." "Ah, it's easy enough for them!" cried the miserable young man. "Women are not liars and traitors because they happen to change their minds. Nobody thinks the worse of them for that. It's their privilege, isn't it? They can break off as many engagements as they like, but if I did such a thing I should never hold up my head again." He buried his hot face in his hands, and Delavoye looked at me for the first time. It was a sympathetic look enough, and yet there was something in it, a lift of the eyebrow, a light in the eye, that reminded me of the one point on which we always differed. "Better hide your head than spoil her life," said he briskly. "But how long have you felt like doing either? I used to look on you as an ideal pair." "So we were," said poor Berridge readily. "It's most peculiar." I saw a twitch at the corners of Uvo's mouth, but he was not the man for sly glances over a bowed head. "How long have you been engaged?" he asked. "Ever since last September." "You were here then, if I remember?" "Yes, it was just after my holiday." "In fact, you've been here all the time?" "Up to these last few weeks." Delavoye looked round his room as a cross-examining counsel surveys the court to mark a point. I felt it about time to intervene on the other side. "But you looked perfectly happy," said I, "all the autumn." "So I was, God knows." "Everything was all right until you went away?" "Everything." "Then," said I, "it looks to me like the mere mental effort of influenza and nothing else." But that was not the sense of the glance I could not help shooting at Delavoye, and my explanation was no comfort to Guy Berridge. He had thought of it before, but then he had never felt better than the last few days in the country, yet never had he been in such despair. "I can't go through with it," he groaned in abject unreserve. "It's making my life a hell, a living lie. I don't know how to bear it, from one meeting to the next. I dread them so. Yet I've always a sort of hope that next time everything will suddenly become as it was before Christmas. Talk of forlorn hopes! Each time's worse than the last. I've come straight from her now. I don't know what you must think of me. It's not 10 minutes since we said good night." The big moustache trembled. "I felt a Judas," he whispered, "an absolute Judas." "I believe it's all nerves," said Delavoye, but with so little conviction that I loudly echoed the belief. "But I don't go in for nerves," protested Berridge. "None of us do in our family. We don't believe in them. We think they're a modern excuse for anything you like to do or say. That's what we think about nerves. I'm not going to start them just to make myself out better than I am. It's my heart that's rotten, not my nerves." "I admire your attitude," said Delavoye, "but I don't agree with you. It'll all come back to you in the end, everything you think you've lost, and then you'll feel as though you'd awakened from a bad dream." "But sometimes I do wake up as it is!" cried Berridge, catching at the idea. "Nearly every morning when I'm dressing things look different. I feel my old self again. The luckiest fellow alive, engaged to the sweetest girl. She's always that, you know. Don't imagine for one moment that I ever think less of Edith. She always was and would be a million times too good for me. If only she'd see it for herself and chuck me up of her own accord. I've even tried to tell her what I feel, but she won't meet me halfway. The real truth never seems to enter her head. How to tell her outright, I don't know. It would have been easy enough last year, when her people wouldn't let us be properly engaged. But they gave in at Christmas, when I had my rise and screw. And now she's got her ring and given me this one. How on earth can I go and give it her back?" "May I see?" asked Delavoye, holding out his hand, and I, for one, was grateful to him for the diversion of the few seconds we spent inspecting an old enamelled ring with a white peacock on a crimson ground. Berridge asked us if we thought it a very peculiar ring, as they all did at Berylstow, and he babbled on about the circumstances of its purchase by his dear, sweet, open-handed Edith. It did him good to talk. A tinge of health returned to his cadaverous cheeks, and for a time his moustache looked less out of keeping and proportion. But it was the mere reactionary surcease of prolonged pain, and the fit came on again in uglier guise before we left. "It isn't so much that I don't want to marry her," declared the accountant with startling abruptness, "as the awful thoughts I have as to what may happen if I do. They're too awful to describe, even to you two fellows. Of course, nothing could make you think worse of me than you must already, but you'd say I was mad if you could see inside my horrible mind. I don't think she'd be safe. Honestly, I don't. I feel as if I might do her some injury, or violence." He was swaying about the room with wild eyes, staring from one to the other of us, and twitching fingers feeling in his pockets. I got up myself and stood within reach of him, for now I felt certain that love or illness had turned his brain. But it was only a very small scrap of paper that he fished out of his waistcoat pocket, and handed first to Delavoye and then to me. "I cut it out of a review of such a peculiar poem in my evening paper," said Berridge. "I never read reviews, or poems, but those lines hit me hard." And I read: "Yet each man kills the thing he loves, by each let this be heard, some do it with a bitter look, some with a flattering word. The coward does it with a kiss, the brave man with a sword." "But you don't feel like that," said Delavoye, laughing at him, and the laughter rang as false as his earlier consolation, but this time I had not the presence of mind to supplement it. Guy Berridge nodded violently as he held out his hand for the verse. I could see that his eyes had filled with tears. But Uvo rolled the scrap of paper into a pellet, which he flung among the lumps of asbestos glowing in his grate, and took the outstretched hand in his. I never saw a man so gentle with another. Hardly a word more passed, but the poor devil squeezed my fingers before Uvo led him out to see him home, and it was many minutes before he returned. "I have had a time of it," said he, putting his feet to the gas fire. "Not with that poor old thing, but his people, all three of them. I got him up straight to bed, and then they kept me when he thought I'd gone. Of course they know there's something wrong, and of course they blame the girl. One knew they would. It seems they've never really approved of her. She's a shocking instance of all-round peculiarity. They little know the apple of their own blind eyes. Eh, Gilly?" "I hardly knew him myself," said I. "He must be daft. I never thought to hear a grown man go on like that." "And such a man!" cried Uvo. "It's not the talk so much as the talker that surprises me. And by the way, how well he talked, for him! He was less of a bore than I've ever known him, and there was passion in the fellow, confound him! Red blood in that lump of road metal! He's not only sorry for himself, he's simply heartbroken about the girl, but this maggot of morbid introspection has got into his brain and how did it get there, Gilly? It's no place for the little brute. What brain is there to feed it? What has he ever done, in all his dull days, to make that harmless mind a breeding ground for every sort of degenerate idea? In mine they'd grow like mustard and cress. I'd feel just like that if I were engaged to the very nicest girl. The nicer she was, the worse I'd get. But then I'm a degenerate dog in any case. Oh, yes, I am, Gilly. But here's a faithful hound as ever licked his lady's hand. Where's he got it from? Who's the poisoner?" "I'm glad you asked," said I. "I was afraid you'd say you knew." "Meaning my old man of the soil?" "I made sure you'd put it on him." Uvo laughed heartily. "You don't know as much about him as I do, Gilly. He was the last old scoundrel to worry because he didn't love a woman as much as she deserved. It was quite the other way about, I can assure you." "Yes, but what about those almost murderous inclinations?" "I thought of them. But they only came on after our good friend had shaken this demoralising dust off his feet. As long as he stuck to Witching Hill, he was as sound as a marriage bell. It's dead against my doctrine, Gillon, but I'm delighted to find that you share my disappointment." "And I to hear you own it is one, Uvo." "There's another thing now we're on the subject," he continued, for we had not been on it for weeks and months. "It seems that over at Hampton Court there's a portrait of my ignoble kinsman, by one Kneller. I only heard of it the other day, and I was rather wondering if you could get away to spin over with me and look him up. It needn't necessarily involve contentious topics, and we might lunch at the Mitre in that window looking down stream. But it ought to be to-morrow if you could manage it, because the galleries don't open on Friday, and on Saturdays they're always crowded." I could not manage it very well. I was supposed to spend my day on the estate, and though there was little doing thus early in the year, it might be the end of me if my Mr. Muskett came back before his usual time and did not find me at my post. And I was no longer indifferent as to the length of my days at Witching Hill. But I resolved to risk them for the man who had made the place what it was to me, a garden of friends, however otherwise he might people and spoil it for himself. We started at my luncheon hour, which could not in any case count against me, and quite early in the afternoon we reckoned to be back. It was a very keen, bright day, worthier of General January than his chief of staff. Ruts and puddles were firmly frozen, our bicycle bells rang out with a pleasing brilliance. In Bushey Park the black chestnuts stamped their filigree tops against a windless radiance. Under the trees a russet carpet still waited for March winds to take it up. The Diana pond was skinned with ice. Goddess and golden nymphs caught every scintillation of cold sunlight as we trundled past. In a fine glow we entered the palace and climbed to the grim old galleries. "Talk about haunted houses," said Uvo Delavoye. "If our patron sinner takes such a fatherly interest in the humble material at his disposal, what about that gay dog Henry and the good ladies in these apartments? I should be sorry to trust living neck to what's left of the old lady killer." It was the famous Holbein which had set him off. "But I say, Gilly, here's a far worse face than his. It may be my rude forefather? By Jove, and so it is!" And he took off his cap with unction to a handsome, sinister creature in a brown flowing wig and raiment as fine as any on the walls. There was a staggering peacock blue surtout, lined with silk of an orange scarlet, the wide sleeves turned up with the same, and a creamy cascade of lace fell from the throat over a long cinnamon waistcoat piped with silk, for you could swear to the material at sight, and the colours might have been laid on that week. They lit up the gloomy chamber, and the eyes in the periwigged head lit them up. The dark eyes at my side were not more live and liquid than the painted pair. Not that Uvo's were cynical, voluptuous, or sly, but like these they reminded me of deep waters hidden from the sun. I refrained from comment on a resemblance that went no further. I was glad I alone had seen how far it went. "Thank goodness those lips and nostrils don't sprout on our branch." Uvo had put up his eyebrows in a humorous way of his. "We must keep a weather eye open for the evil that they did living after them on Witching Hill. You may well stare at his hands. They probably weren't his at all, but done from a model. I hope the old Turk hadn't quite such a ladylike—" He stopped short, as I knew he would, when he saw what I was pointing out to him, for I had not been staring at the effeminate hand affectedly composed on the corner of a table, but at the enamelled ring painted like a miniature on the little finger. "Good Lord!" cried Delavoye. "That's the very ring we saw last night." It was at least a perfect counterfeit. The narrow stem, the high projecting oval bezel, the white peacock enamelled on a crimson ground, one and all were there, as the painters of that period loved to put such things in. It must be the same, Gilly. There couldn't be two such utter oddities. It looks like it, certainly, but how did Miss Hemming get hold of it? Easily enough. She ferrets out all the old curiosity shops in the district, and didn't Berridge tell us she bought his ring in one? Obviously it's been lying there for the last century and a bit. Bear in mind that this bad old lot wasn't worth a bob towards the end. Then you must see the whole thing so plain, there's only one thing plainer. What's that? The entire cause and origin of Guy Berridge's pangs and fears about his engagement. He never had one or the other before Christmas, when he got his ring. They've made his life a Hades ever since, every day of it and every hour of every day, except sometimes in the morning, when he was getting up. Why not then? Because he took off his ring when he went to his bath. I'll go so far as to remind you that his only calm and rational moments last night were while you and I were looking at this ring and it was off his finger." Delavoye's strong excitement was attracting the attention of the old soldierly attendant near the window, and in a vague way that veteran attracted mine. I glanced past him, out and down into the formal grounds. Yew and cedar seemed unreal to me in the wintry sunlight. Almost I wondered whether I was dreaming in my turn, and where on earth I was. It was as though a touch of the fantastic had rested for a moment even on my hard head. But I very soon shook it off, and mocked the vanquished weakness with a laugh. "Yes, my dear fellow, that's all very well, but—" "None of your blooming buts!" cried Uvo, with almost delirious levity. "I should have thought this instant was concrete enough even for you. But we'll talk about it at the Mitre, and consider what to do." In that talk I joined. Into those considerations I entered without arguing at all. It did not commit me to a single article of a repugnant creed, but neither, on the other hand, did it impair the excellence of Delavoye's company at a hurried feast which still stands out in my recollection. I remember the long red wall of Hampton Court as the one warm feature of the hard-bitten landscape. I remember red wine in our glasses, a tinge of colour in the dusky face that leant towards mine, and a wondrous flow of eager talk, delightful as long as one did not take it too seriously. My own attitude I recapture most securely in Uvo's accusation that I smiled and was a sceptic. It was one of those characteristic remarks that stick for no other reason. Uvo Delavoye was not in those days at all widely read, but he had a large circle of quotations which were not altogether unfamiliar to me, and I eventually realised that he knew his Hamlet almost off by heart. But yet poor Berridge's Pangs and Fears was original Delavoye to my ruder culture, and the next time I saw him, on the Friday night, the pangs seemed keener and the fears even more enervating than before. Again he sat with us in Uvo's room, but he was oftener on his legs, striding up and down, muttering and gesticulating as he strode. In the end Uvo took a strong line with him. I was waiting for it. He had conceived the scheme at Hampton Court, and I was curious to see how it would be received. "This can't go on, Berridge. I'll see you through to the bitter end." Uvo was not an actor, yet here was a magnificent piece of acting, because it was more than half sincere. "Will you really, Delavoye?" cried the accountant, shrinking a little from his luck. "Rather! I'm not going to let you go stark mad under my nose. Give me that ring." Her ring? "Of course. It's your engagement ring, isn't it? And it's your duty to yourself and her and everybody else to break off that engagement with as little further delay as possible." "But are you sure, Delavoye?" "Certain. Give it to me." "It seems such a frightful thing to do." "We'll see about that. Thank you. Now you're your own man again." And now I really did begin to open my eyes, for no sooner had the unfortunate accountant parted with his ring than his ebbing affections rushed back in a miraculous flood, and he was begging for it again in 5 minutes, vowing that he had been mad but now was sane, and looking more himself into the bargain. But Delavoye was adamant to these hysterical entreaties. He plied Berridge with his own previous arguments against the marriage, and once at least he struck a responsive chord from those frayed nerves. "Nobody but yourself," he pointed out, "ever said you didn't love her. But see what love makes of you. Can you dream of marriage in such a state? Is it fair to the girl, until you've really reconsidered the whole matter and learnt your own mind once for all? Could she be happy? Would she be? It was your own suggestion. But are you sure she would be even safe?" Berridge wrung his hands in new despair. Yes, he had forgotten that. Those awful instincts were the one unalterably awful feature. Not that he felt them still, but to recollect them as genuine impulses, or at best as irresistible thoughts, was to freeze his self-distrust into a cureless cancer. "I was forgetting all that," he moaned, "and yet here in my pocket is the very book those hopeless lines are from. I bought it at Stoneham's this morning. It's the most peculiar poem I ever read. I can't quite make it out. But that bit was clear enough. Only hear how it goes on." And in a school-childish sing-song, with no expression but that involuntarily imparted by his quavering voice, he read 12 lines aloud. "Some kill their love when they are young, and some when they are old. Some strangle with the hands of lust, some with the hands of gold. The kindest use a knife because—" He shuddered horribly. "The dead so soon grow cold. Some love too little, some too long, some sell and others buy. Some do the deed with many tears, and some without a sigh. For each man kills the thing he loves, yet each man does not die." "It's all I'm fit for, death," groaned Guy Berridge, trying to tug the fierce moustache out of his mild face. "The sooner the better for me. And yet I did love her, God knows I did." He turned upon Uvo Delavoye in a sudden blaze. "And so I do still. Do you hear me? Then give me back my ring, I say, and don't encourage me in this madness, you devil!" "Give it him back," I said. But Uvo set his teeth against us both, looking almost what he had just been called, looking abominably like that fine, evil gentleman in Hampton Court. And I could stand the whole thing no longer. I rammed my own hand into Delavoye's pocket, and down and away out into the night, like a fiend let loose, went Guy Berridge and the ring with the peacock enamelled in white on a blood-red ground. I turned again to Delavoye. His shoulders were up to his ears in wry good humour. "You may be right, Gilly, but now I ought really to sit up with him all night. In any case, I shall have it back in the morning, and then neither you nor he shall ever see that unclean bird again." But he went so far as to show it to me across the counter, not many minutes after young Berridge had shambled past, with bent head and unshaven cheeks, to catch his usual train next morning. "I did sit up with him," said Uvo. "We sat up till he dropped off in his chair, and eventually I got him to bed more asleep than awake. But he's as bad as ever again this morning, and he has surrendered the infernal ring, this time of his own accord. I'm to break matters to the girl by giving it back to her." "You're a perfect hero to take it on." "I feel much more of a humbug, Gilly." "When do you tackle her?" "Never, my dear fellow. Can't you see the point? This white peacock's at the bottom of the whole thing. Neither of them shall ever set eyes on it again, and then you see if they don't marry and live happy ever after." "But are you going to throw the thing away?" "Not if I can help it, Gilly. I'll tell you what I thought of doing. There's a little working jeweller over at Richmond, who made me quite a good pin out of some heavy old studs that belonged to my father. I'm going to take him this ring to-day, and see if he can turn out a duplicate for love or money." "I'll go with you," I said, "if you can wait till the afternoon." "We must be gone before Berridge has a chance of getting back," replied Uvo doubtfully. Otherwise I shall have to begin all over again, because of course he'll come back cured and roaring for his ring. I haven't quite decided what to say to him, but I fancy my imagination will prove equal to the strain." This seemed to me a rather cynical attitude to take, even in the best of causes, and it certainly was not like Uvo Delavoye. Only too capable, in my opinion, of deceiving himself, he was no impostor if I knew him, and it was disappointing to see him take so kindly to the part. I preferred not to talk about it on the road to Richmond, which we took on foot in the small hours of the afternoon. A weeping thaw had reduced the frozen ruts to mere mud piping, of that consistency which grips a tire like teeth. But it was impossible not to compare this heavy tramp with our sparkling spin through Bushey Park, and the hot and cold fits of poor Guy Berridge afforded an inevitable analogy. "I can't understand him," I was saying. "I can understand a fellow falling in love, and even falling out again, but Berridge flies from one extreme to the other like a ball in a hard rally." "And it's not the way he's built, Gilly. That's what sticks with me. You may be quite sure he's not the first breeder of sinners who began by shivering on the brink of matrimony. It's a desperate plunge to take. I should be terrified myself. But then I'm not one of nature's faithful hounds. If it wasn't for the canine fidelity of this good Berridge, I shouldn't mind his thinking and shrinking like many a better man." We were cutting off the last corner before Richmond by following the asphalt footpath behind St. Stephen's Church. Here we escaped the mud at last. The moist asphalt shone with a cleanly lustre, and our footsteps threw an echo ahead between the two long walls until it mixed with the tramp of approaching feet, and another couple advanced into view. They were man and girl, but I did not at first identify the radiant citizen in the glossy hat, with his arm thrust through the lady's, as Guy Berridge, homeward bound with his once beloved. It was a groan from Uvo that made me look again, and the next moment the four of us blocked the narrow gangway. "The very man we were talking about!" cried Berridge, without looking at me. His hat had been ironed, his weak chin burnished by a barber's shave, the strong moustache clipped and curled, but a sporadic glow marked either cheekbone, and he had forgotten to return our salute. "Yes, Mr. Delavoye," said Miss Hemming with arch severity. "What have you been doing with my white peacock?" She had a brown fringe, very crisply curled as a rule, but the damp air had softened and improved it, and perhaps her young gentleman's recovery had carried the good work deeper, for she was a girl who sometimes gave herself airs, but there seemed no room for any in her happy face. "To tell you the truth," replied Uvo unblushingly, "I was on my way to show it to a bit of a connoisseur at Richmond." He turned to Berridge, who met his glance eagerly. "That's really why I borrowed it, Guy. I believe it's more valuable than either of you realise." "Not to me!" cried the accountant readily. "I don't know what I was doing to take it off. I hear it's a most unlucky thing to do." It was easy to see from whom he had heard it. Miss Hemming said nothing, but looked all the more decided with her mouth quite shut, and Delavoye addressed his apologies to the proper quarter. "I'm awfully sorry, Miss Hemming. Of course you're quite right, but I hope you'll show it to my man yourselves." "If you don't mind," said Berridge, holding out his hand with a smile. But Uvo had broken off of his own accord. "I think you'll be glad," he was feeling in all his pockets, "quite glad if you do," and his voice died away as he began feeling again. "Lucky I wired to you to meet me at Richmond, wasn't it, Edie? Otherwise we should have been too late," said the accountant densely. "Perhaps you are," poor Uvo had to cry outright. The fact is, I can't find it anywhere." "You may have left it behind," suggested Berridge. "We can call for it if you did," said the girl. There was something in his sudden worry that appealed to their common fund of generosity. No, I told you why I was going to Richmond. I thought I had it in my ticket pocket. In fact, I know I had. but I went out with my sister this morning to get some flowers at Kingston Market, and I haven't had it out since. It's been taken from me, and that was where. I wish you would feel in my pockets for me. I've had them picked of the one thing that wasn't mine, and was of value. And now you'll neither one of you ever forgive me, and I don't deserve to be forgiven." But they did forgive him, and that handsomely. So manifest was his distress, so great their recovered happiness. It was only I who could not follow their example. When they had gone on their way, and Delavoye and I were hurrying on ours, ostensibly to get the Richmond police to telephone at once to Kingston, as the first of all the energetic steps that we were going to take. For we were still in that asphalt passage, and the couple had scarcely quitted it at the other end when Delavoye drew off his glove and showed me the missing ring upon his little finger. I could hardly believe my eyes, or my ears either, when he roundly defended his conduct. I need not go into his defence. It was the only one it could have been. But Uvo Delavoye was the only man in England who could and would have made it with a serious face. It was no mere trinket that he had lifted, but a curse from two innocent heads. That end justified any means, to his wild thinking. But over and over the ethical question, he had an inherited responsibility in the matter, and had only performed a duty which had been thrust upon him. "Nor shall they be a bit the worse off," said Uvo warmly. "I still mean to have that duplicate made, off my own bat, and when I foist it on our friends, I shall simply say it turned up in the lining of my overcoat." "Man Uvo," said I, "there are two professions waiting for you, but it would take a judge of both to choose between your fiction and your acting." "Acting!" he cried. "Why, a blog like Guy Berridge can act when he's put to it. He did just now, and took you in, evidently. It never struck you, I suppose, that he'd wired to me this morning to say nothing to the girl, probably at the same time that he wired to her to meet him. He carried it all off like a born actor just now, and yet you curse me for going and doing likewise to save the pair of them." It is always futile to try to slay the bee in another's bonnet, but for once I broke my rule of never arguing with Uvo Delavoye if I could help it, on the particular point involved. I simply could not help it on this occasion, and when Uvo lost his temper, and said a great deal more than I would have taken from anybody else, I would not have helped it if I could. So hot had been our interchange that it was at its height when we debouched from St. Stephen's Passage into the open cross-roads beyond. At that unlucky moment, one small suburban Arab, in full flight from another, dashed round the corner and butted into that part of Delavoye which the Egyptian climate had specially demoralised. I saw his dark face writhe with pain and fury. With one hand he caught the offending urchin, and in the other I was horrified to see his stick, a heavy blackthorn, held in murderous poise against the leaden sky, while the child was thrust out at arm's length to receive the blow. I hurled myself between them, and had such difficulty in wresting the blackthorn from the madman's grasp that his hand was bleeding, and something had tinkled on the pavement when I tore it from him. Panting, I looked to see what had become of the small boy. He had taken to his heels as though the foul fiend were at them. His late pursuer was now his companion in flight, and I was thankful to find we had the scene to ourselves. Delavoye was pointing to the little thing that had tinkled as it fell, and as he pointed the blood dripped from his hand, and he shuddered like a man recovering from a fit. I had better plainly admit that the thing was that old ring with the white peacock set in red, and that Uvo Delavoye was once more as I had known him down to that hour. "Don't touch the beastly thing!" he cried. "It served me worse than it served poor Berridge. I shall have to think of a fresh lie to tell him, and it won't come so easy now, but I'd rather cut mine off than trust this on another human hand." He picked it up between his fingernails, and there was blood on the white peacock when I saw it next on Richmond Bridge. "Don't you worry about my hand," said Uvo, as he glanced up and down the grey old bridge. It's only a scratch from the blackthorn spikes, but I'd have given a finger to be shot of this devil." A flick of his wrist sent the old ring spinning. We saw it meet its own reflection in the glassy flood like a salmon fly beautifully thrown, and more rings came and widened on the waters till they stirred the mirrored branches of the trees on Richmond Hill. End of chapter 3. Chapter 4 of Witching Hill by E.W. Hornung. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. The Local Colour. The Reverend Charles Brabazon, magnetic vicar of the adjacent village, had as strong a personality as one could wish to encounter in real life. He did what he liked with a congregation largely composed of the motley worldlings of Witching Hill. Small solicitors and West End tradesmen, bank officials, outside brokers, first-class clerks in government offices. They had not a Sunday soul to call their own, these hard-headed holders of season tickets to Waterloo. Throughout the summer they flocked to church when their hearts were on the river. In the depths of winter they got up for early celebrations on the one morning when they might have lain abed. Their most obsequious devotions did not temper the preacher's truculence, any more than his strongest onslaught discouraged their good works. They gave of their substance at his every call, and were even more lavish on their own initiative. Thus, in my second summer at Witching Hill, the vicarage was practically rebuilt out of the pockets of parishioners, and we had no difficulty in providing a furnished substitute on the favourite woodland site of Mulcaster Park. Great was the jealousy in Witching Hill Road, but futile the fluttering of our Queen Anne dovecots, for we saw very little more of the vicar for having him in our midst. He was always either immured in his study, or else hurrying to and from some service or parochial engagement, and although he had a delightful roadside manner, and the same fine smile for high and low, he would stop to speak to neither on his way. Out of church, in fact, Mr. Brabazon preserved a wise aloofness, which only served to emphasise the fierce intimacy of his pulpit utterances, and combined with his contempt of popularity to render him by far the most popular figure in the neighbourhood. It goes without saying that this remarkable man was a high churchman and a celibate. His house was kept, and his social shortcomings made good, by the two Mrs. Brabazon, each as unlike him as possible in her own way. Miss Ruth, who was younger, added to her brother's energy a sympathetic charm and a really good voice which made her the darling of the parish hall and humbler edifices. Miss Julia's activities were more sedentary and domestic, as perhaps became the least juvenile of the trio, and so it was that I saw most of her. We had a whole day together over the inventory, and it was Miss Julia who interviewed me about everything else connected with the house. She was never short with me on those occasions, never ungracious, or, what is worse, unduly gracious, but she had always a pleasant word and nearly always an innocent little joke as well. Innocence and jocosity were two of her leading characteristics. Another was a genuine but ingenuous literary faculty. This she exercised in editing the parish magazine, and supplying it with moral serials which occasionally reached volume form under the auspices of the Religious Tract Society. On an evening late in April, when the cuckoo was wound up in the wood behind Mulcaster Park, and most of the beds in front were flowering for the first time, a gaunt figure came to the gate of the temporary vicarage and beckoned to me passing on the other side of the road. It was Miss Julia, and I found her looking gently humorous and knowing across the gate. "The trees are coming out so beautifully," she began, "and the grounds behind these gardens. I was wondering if it would be possible to procure a permit to go over them, Mr. Gillon?" "Do you mean for yourself, Miss Brabazon?" "Well, yes, as a matter of fact I do." As she spoke, I could not but notice that she glanced ever so slightly towards the house behind her, and that her voice had fallen to a murmur, while a mottled colouring appeared between the lines of her guileless visage. "I'm afraid I can't do anything," I said. "But the Vicar could, Miss Brabazon," I added with conviction. "A line from him to Sir Christopher Stainsby." I stopped because Miss Julia shook her head so decidedly. "That would never do, Mr. Gillon. Sir Christopher is such a very rabid dissenter." "So I have heard," I admitted, thinking rather of what I had seen. "But I don't believe he's as narrow as you think." "I couldn't trouble the Vicar about it, in any case," said Miss Brabazon hurriedly. "I shouldn't even like him to know that I had troubled you, Mr. Gillon. He's such a severe critic that I never tell him what I'm writing until it's finished." "Then you are writing something about Witching Hill House, Miss Brabazon?" "I was thinking of it. I haven't begun. But I never saw any place that I felt such a desire to write about. The old house in the old woods, say 100 years ago. Don't you think it an ideal scene for a story, Mr. Gillon?" "It depends on the story you want to tell," said I sententiously. A strange light was burning in the weak eyes of Miss Julia. It might almost have been a flicker of the divine fire. But now she dropped her worn eyelids and gazed into the road with the dreamy cunning of the born creator. "I should have quite a plot," she decided. "It would be about some extraordinary person who lived in there, in the wood and the house, only of course ages and ages ago. I think I should make him, in fact I'm quite sure he would be, a very wicked person, though of course he'd have to come all right in the end." "You must be thinking of the man who really did live there." "Who was that?" "The infamous Lord Mulcaster." "Really, Mr. Gillon? I don't think I ever heard of him. Of course I know the present family by name. Aren't these Delavoyes connected with him in some way?" I explained the connection as I knew it, which was not very thoroughly. But I unfortunately said enough to cause a rapid fall in poor Miss Julia's mottled countenance. "Then I must give up the idea of that story. They would think I meant their ancestor, and that would never do. I'm sorry, because I never felt so inclined to write anything before. But I'm very glad you told me, Mr. Gillon." "But they wouldn't mind a bit, Miss Brabazon. They're not in the least sensitive about him," I assured her. "I couldn't think of it," replied Miss Julia haughtily. "It would be in the very worst of taste." "But Uvo would love it. He's full of the old villain. He might help you if you'd let him. He's at the British Museum at this moment, getting deeper and deeper into what he calls the family mire." "I happened to see him coming down the road," observed Miss Julia dryly. "I must really beg that you will not refer to the subject again, Mr. Gillon." But in her voice and manner there was a hesitating reluctance that emboldened me to use my own judgment about that, especially when Uvo Delavoye, whose mother and sister were keen Brabazonians, himself introduced the topic on joining us, with a gratuitous remark about his unfilial excavations in Bloomsbury. "I've opened up a new lazar house this very day," he informed us, with shining eyes, when Miss Julia had shown an interest in spite of herself. "By the way," I cut in, "don't you think it would all make magnificent material for a novel, Uvo?" "If you could find anybody to publish it," he answered, laughing. "You wouldn't mind if he was put into a book, and the place as well?" "I wouldn't, if nobody else didn't. Why, who's thinking of doing us the honour?" Dear Miss Julia coughed and laughed with delicious coyness. My liberty had been condoned. "Was it you, Miss Brabazon?" cried Uvo, straightening his face with the nerve that never failed him at a climax. "Well, it was and it wasn't," she replied, exceedingly slyly. "I did think I should like to write a little story about Witching Hill House, and put in rather a bad character. At least he would begin by being rather undesirable, perhaps. But I was forgetting that the place had been in your family, Mr. Delavoye. I certainly never knew, until Mr. Gillon told me, that one of the Lords Mulcaster had been, perhaps no better than he ought to have been?" "To put it mildly," said Delavoye, with smiling face and shrieking eyes, "you may paint the bad old hat as black as mine, Miss Brabazon, and still turn him out a saint compared with the villain of the case I've been reading up to day. So you really needn't worry about anybody's susceptibilities. Lay on the local colour inches deep. You won't make the place as red as the old gentleman painted it in blood and wine." "Really, Mr. Delavoye!" cried Miss Julia, jocosely shocked. "You mustn't forget that my story would only appear in our parish magazine unless the R.T.S. took it afterwards." "My rude forefather in a religious tract?" "Of course I should quite reform him in the end." "You'd have your work cut out, Miss Brabazon." "I ought to begin with you, you know," said Miss Julia, shaking a facetious finger in Uvo's face. "I'm afraid you're rather an irreverent young man, and I don't know what the Vicar would say if he heard us." She threw another deliciously guilty glance towards the house. "But if you really mean what you say, and if you're sure Mrs. Delavoye and your sister won't mind either—" "Mind?" he interrupted. "Forgive me, Miss Brabazon, but how could they be sensitive about the last head but 5 of a branch of the family which doesn't even recognise our existence?" "Very well, then, I'll take you at your word, and the blood and thunder," whispered Miss Julia, as though they were bad words, "be on your own head, Mr. Delavoye." Thereafter, in a quivering silence, Uvo took me home with him and straight up to his own room, where he first shut the door and window without a word. Never since have I heard a man laugh quite so loud and as long as he did then. "But you don't see the point," he arrogated through his tears, because I made rather less noise. "What is it, then?" "I told you I'd opened up a new sink to day?" "You said something of the sort." "It was a sink of fresh iniquity. I came across it in an old collection of trials. It isn't as much as mentioned in any memoir of the old reprobate, nor yet in the many annals of Witching Hill. Yet he once figured in one of the most disgraceful cases on record." The case was all that, as Delavoye summed it up for my benefit. The arch-villain of the piece was, of course, his scandalous progenitor, aided and abetted by a quite unspeakable crew. There was a sorely distressed heroine in humble life, a poor little milliner from Shoreditch, but because it was all too true, there had been no humble hero to wreak poetic vengeance on the miscreant. Not a nursery story, I grant you, but there were some very good touches in the version I struck, said Delavoye, producing his museum notebook. One or two I couldn't help taking down. In obedience to the custom of the times, for instance, the young lord proceeded to perform the grand tour, and it is reported that having sailed from Naples to Constantinople, he there imbibed so great an admiration for the manners of the Turks that on his return to England in 1766 he caused an outlying portion of his family mansion to be taken down and to be rebuilt in the form of a harem. Rot! I took it down word for word. I've often wondered how the Turkish pavilion got its name. Now we know all about it, and why it had a tunnel connecting it with the house. Poor little milliner! I believe you, Gilly. Listen to this. When she was a prisoner in his town house, before they spirited her out here. Looking out of the window at about 8 o'clock, she observed a young woman passing, to whom she threw out her handkerchief, which was then heavy with tears, intending to attract her attention and send to her father for assistance. Because the handkerchief was marked? And so heavy with her tears that she could throw it like a tennis ball. The notebook was put away. There was an end also of our hilarity. "And this dear old girl," said Uvo, with affectionate disrespect, "thinks she's fit and proper writer to cope with that immortal skunk? False Sextus in a parish magazine? Proud Tarquin done really proud at last." It was on the tip of my tongue to make it quite clear to Uvo that Miss Julia had not wittingly proposed to write about his ancestor at all, that apparently she had never heard of his existence before that evening, and that it was her own original idea to make Witching Hill House the haunt of some purely imaginary scoundrel. But I knew my Uvo well enough by this time to hold my tongue, and at least postpone the tiresome discussion of a rather stale point on which we were never likely to agree. But I stayed to supper at number 7, and Uvo kept me till the small hours, listening to further details of his last researches, and to the farrago of acute conjecture, gay reminiscence, and vivid hearsay which his reading invariably inspired. It was base subject metal that did not gain a certain bright refinement in his fiery mind, or fall from his lips with a lively ring, and that night he was at its best about things which have an opposite effect on many young men. It must have been after 1 when I left him. I saw the light go out behind the cheap stained glass in the front door, and I heard Uvo going upstairs as I departed. The next and only other light I passed, in the houses on that side of the road, was at the top of the one which was now the vicarage. Thence also came an only sound. It was the continuous crackle of a typewriter through the open window of the room which I knew Miss Julia had appropriated as her own. That end of the estate had by this time a full team of tenants, whereas I had 2 sets of painters and paper hangers to keep up to the mark in Witching Hill Road. This rather came between me and my friends in Mulcaster Park, especially as my Mr. Muskett lived in their road, and his house had eyes and a tongue. So it happened that I saw no more of Miss Julia Brabazon until she paid me a queer little visit at my office one afternoon about 5 o'clock. She was out of breath, and her flurried manner quickened my ear to the sound of her brother's bells ringing in the distance for week-day evensong. "I thought I'd like to have one word with you, Mr. Gillon, about my story," she panted, with a guilty shrinking from the sheet of glass behind her. "It will be finished in a few days now, I'm thankful to say. I've been so hard at work upon it, you can't think." "Oh, yes, I can," said I, for there seemed to be many more lines on the simple, eager countenance. The drollery had gone out of it, and its heightened colouring had an unhealthy, bluish tinge. "I'm afraid I have been burning the midnight oil a little," she admitted with a sort of coy bravado. "But there seems so much to do during the day, and everything is so quiet at night, unless it's that wretched typewriter of mine. But I muffle the bell, and luckily my brother and sister are sound sleepers." "You must be keen, Miss Brabazon, to turn night into day." "Keen? I never enjoyed writing half so much. It's no effort, the story simply writes itself. I don't feel as if it were a story at all, but something that I see and hear and have just got to get down as fast as ever I can. I feel as if I really knew that old monster we were talking about the other day. Sometimes he quite frightens me. And that's why I've come to you, Mr. Gillon. I almost fear I'm making him too great a horror after all." It was impossible not to smile. "That would be a difficult matter, from all I hear, Miss Brabazon." "I meant from the point of view of his descendants in general, and these dear Delavoyes in particular. Rather than hurt their feelings, Mr. Gillon, I need hardly tell you I'd destroy my story in a minute." "That would be 1,000 pities," said I, honestly thinking of her wasted time. "I'm not so sure," said Miss Julia doubtfully. "I sometimes think, when I read the newspapers, that there are bad people enough in the world without digging up more from their graves. Yet at other times I don't feel as if I were doing that either. It's more as though this wicked old wretch had come to life of his own accord and insisted on being written about. I seem to feel him almost at my elbow, forcing me to write down I don't know what." "But that sounds like inspiration," I exclaimed, impressed by the good faith patent in the tired, ingenuous, serio-comic face. "I don't know what it is," replied Miss Julia, "or whether I'm writing sense or nonsense. I never like to look next day. I only know that at the time I quite frightened myself, and make as big a fool of myself as though I were in my poor heroine's shoes, which is so absurd." She laughed uneasily, her colour slightly heightened. "But I only meant to ask you, Mr. Gillon, whether you honestly and truly think that the Delavoyes won't mind? You see, he really was their ancestor, and I do make him a most odious creature." "But I don't suppose you give him his real name?" "Oh dear no, that would never do. I call him the Duke of Dohampton, and the story is called His Graceless Grace. Isn't it a good title, Mr. Gillon?" I lied like a man, but was still honest enough to add that I thought it even better as a disguise. "I feel sure, Miss Brabazon, that you are worrying yourself unnecessarily," I took it upon myself to assert, but indeed her title alone would have reassured me, had I for a moment shared her conscientious qualms. "I am so glad you think so," said Miss Julia, visibly relieved. "Still, I shall not offer the story anywhere until Mr. Delavoye has seen or heard every word of it." "I thought it was for your own parish magazine." Miss Julia at last obliged me with her most facetious and most confidential smile. "I am not tied down to the parish magazine," said she. "There are higher fields. I am not certain that His Graceless Grace is altogether suited to the young parishioner, Mr. Gillon. I must read it over and see. And yes, I shall invite Mr. Delavoye to come and hear it before I decide to send it anywhere at all." The reading actually took place on an evening in May, when the Vicar had accompanied his younger sister up to Exeter Hall, and at the last moment I also received a verbal invitation, delivered and inspired by that rascal Uvo, who declared that I had let him in for the infliction and must bear my share. More justly, he argued, that the pair of us might succeed in keeping each other awake, whereas one alone would infallibly disgrace himself, and we had solemnly agreed upon a system of watch and watch by the alternate quarter of an hour before we presented ourselves at the temporary vicarage after supper. Miss Julia received us in stiff silk that supplied a sort of sibilant obligato to a nervous welcome, and her voice maintained a secretive pitch, even when the maid had served coffee and shut the door behind her, lending a surreptitious air to the proceedings before they could be said to have begun. It was impossible not to wonder what the Vicar would have said to see his elderly sister discoursing profane fiction to a pair of heathens who seldom set foot inside his church. He would scarcely have listened with our resignation, for poor Miss Julia read as badly as she wrote, and never was story opened with clumsier ineptitude than hers. We had sheet upon typewritten sheet about the early life and virtuous vicissitudes of some deplorably dull young female in the East End of London, and in my case slumber was imminent when the noble villain made his entry in the cinnamon waistcoat of the picture at Hampton Court. At that I tried to catch Uvo's eye, but it was already fixed upon the reader's face with an intensity which soon attracted her attention. "Isn't that your idea of him, Mr. Delavoye?" asked Miss Julia apprehensively. "Well, yes, it is, but it was Sir Godfrey Kneller's first," said Uvo, laughing. "So you took the trouble to go all the way over there to study his portrait, Miss Brabazon?" "What portrait? All the way over where, Mr. Delavoye?" Uvo entered into particulars, which left the lady's face a convincing blank. She had seen no portrait. It was years since she had been through the galleries at Hampton Court, and then without a catalogue. Uvo seemed to experience so much difficulty in crediting this disclaimer that I asked whether cinnamon had not been a favourite colour with the Bloods of the 18th century. On his assent the reading proceeded in a slightly altered voice, in which I thought I detected a note of not unnatural umbrage. But far greater coincidences were in store, and those of such a character that it was certainly difficult to believe that they were anything of the sort. Considered as an attempt at dramatic narrative, the story was, of course, beneath criticism. It was all redundant description, gratuitous explanations, facetious turns to serious sentences, and declared intentions which entirely spoilt the effect of their due fulfilment. Bored to extinction with the heroine, who only became interesting on the villain's advent as his predestined prey, we thenceforth heard no more of her until his antecedents had been set forth in solid slabs of the pluperfect tense. These dwelt with stolid solemnity upon the distinctions and debaucheries of his university career, and then all at once on the effect of subsequent travel upon a cynical yet impressionable mind. In an instant both of us were attending, and even I guessed what was coming and what had happened. Probably by half-forgotten hearsay, our dear good lady had tapped the same muddy stream as Uvo Delavoye, and some of the mud had silted into a mind too innocent to appreciate its quality. Debased and degraded by the wicked splendours of barbaric courts, the unprincipled young nobleman had decided not only to "do" in Turkey as the Turkeys did, but to initiate the heathen institution of polygamy among his own broad acres on his return to England, home, and only too much beauty. Poor, innocent, confiding Millicent, little did she dream, when he asked her to be his, that he only meant one of the many, that the place awaiting her was but her niche in the seraglio which he had wickedly had built in a corner of his stately grounds on some Eastern model. Delavoye looked at me without a trace of amusement, but rather in alarmed recognition of the weirdly sustained parallel between rascal fact and foolish fiction. But as yet we had only scratched the thin ice of the situation. Soon we were almost shuddering from our knowledge of the depths below. The unhappy heroine had repulsed the advances of the villain in the story, as in the actual case. In both she was the same locality, where, however, our vicar had held his last curacy. In both, enticed into his lordship's coach, and driven off at a great rate to his London mansion, where the first phase of her harrowing adventures ensued. So innocently were these described that we must have roared over them by ourselves, but there was no temptation to smile under the rosy, droll nose of poor Miss Julia, by this time warm to her work and reeling off her own interminable periods with pathetic zest. Yet even her jocose and sidelong style could no longer conceal an interest which had become more dramatic than she was aware. Just as at first had taken charge of her pen, so her story had now gained undisputed command of the poor lady's lips, and she was actually reading it far better than at first, as if subconsciously stimulated by our rapt attention, though mercifully ignorant of its uncomfortable quality. I speak only for myself, and it may be that as a very young man I took the whole business more seriously than I should to-day. But I must own there were some beads upon my forehead when Delavoye relieved the tension by jumping to his feet in unrestrained excitement. "I'm glad you like that," said Miss Julia, with a pleased smile, "because I thought it was good myself. Her handkerchief would have her name on it, you see, and she was able to throw it out of the window like a stone at the feet of the first passer-by, because it was so heavy with her tears. Of course she hoped the person who picked it up would see the name and—" "Of course!" cried Uvo cavalierly. "It was an excellent idea. I always thought so." Miss Julia eyed him with a puzzled smirk. "How could you always think a thing I've only just invented?" she asked acutely. "Well, you see, it's happened in real life before to-day," he faltered, seeing his mistake. "Like a good deal of my story, it appears?" "Like something in every story that was ever written. Truth, you know." "Quite so, Mr. Delavoye, but I saw you looking at Mr. Gillon a minute ago as though something else was familiar to you both, and I should just like to know what it was." "I'm sure I've forgotten, Miss Brabazon." "It wasn't the part about the Turkish building in the grounds, I suppose?" "Yes," said Uvo, turning honest in desperation. "And where am I supposed to have read about that?" "I'm quite certain you never read it at all, Miss Brabazon." Now Miss Julia had lost neither her temper nor her smile, and she had not been more severe on Delavoye than his unsatisfactory method invited. But the obvious sincerity of his last answer appeased her pique, and she leaned forward in sudden curiosity. "Then there is a book about him, Mr. Delavoye?" "Not exactly a book." "I know!" she cried. "It's the case you'd been reading the other night, isn't it?" "Perhaps it is." "Was he actually tried, that Lord Mulcaster?" The wretched Uvo groaned and nodded. "What for, Mr. Delavoye?" "His life!" exclaimed Uvo, moistening his lips. Miss Julia beamed and puckered with excitement. "How very dreadful, to be sure! And had he actually committed a murder?" "I've no doubt he had," said Uvo eagerly. "I wouldn't put anything past him, as they say. But in those days it wasn't necessary to take life in order to forfeit your own. There were lots of other capital offences. The mere kidnapping of the young lady, exactly as you describe it." "But did he really do such a thing?" demanded Miss Julia. And her obviously genuine amazement redoubled mine. "Exactly as you have described it," repeated Delavoye. "He travelled in the East, commenced Bluebeard on his return, fished his Fatima like yours out of some little shop down Shoreditch way, and even drove her to your expedient of turning her tears to account." And he dared to give me another look, shot with triumph, while Miss Julia supported an invidious position as best she might. "Wait a bit," I said, stepping in at last. "I thought I gathered from you the other day, Miss Brabazon, that you felt the reality of your story intensely?" "I did indeed, Mr. Gillon." "It distressed you very much?" "I might have been going through the whole thing." It even moved you to tears?" "I should be ashamed to say how many." "I dare say," I pursued, smiling with all my might, "that even your handkerchief was heavy with them, Miss Brabazon?" "It was." "Then so much for the origin of that idea. It would have occurred to anybody under similar circumstances." Miss Julia gave me the smile I wanted. I felt I had gone up in her estimation, and sent Delavoye down. But I had reckoned without his genius for taking a dilemma by the horns. "This is an old quarrel between Gillon and me, Miss Brabazon. I hold that all Witching Hill is more or less influenced by the wicked old wizard of the place. Mr. Gillon says it's all in my eye, and simply will not let belief take hold of him. Yet your Turkish building actually existed within a few feet of where we're sitting now. And suppose the very leaves on the trees still whisper about it to those who have ears to hear. Suppose you've taken the whole thing down almost at dictation. I don't know how your story goes on, Miss Brabazon." "No more do I," said Miss Brabazon, manifestly impressed, and not at all offended by his theory. "It's a queer thing. I never should have thought of such a thing myself, but I certainly did dash it all off as if somebody was telling me what to say, and at such a rate that my mind's still a blank from one page to the next." She picked the script out of her lap, and we watched her bewildered face as it puckered to a frown over the rustling sheets. "I shouldn't wonder," said Delavoye a little hastily, "if his next effort wasn't to subvert her religious beliefs." "To make game of them?" assented Miss Julia in scandalised undertones. "The demoniacal Duke now set himself to deface and destroy the beauty of holiness, to cast away the armour of light, and to put upon him the true colours of an aristocratic atheist of the deepest dye." "Exactly what he did," murmured Uvo, with another look at me. It was not a look of triumph unalloyed. It was at least as full of vivid apprehension. "I shall cross that out," said Miss Julia decidedly. "I don't know what I was thinking of to write anything like that. It really makes me almost afraid to go on." Uvo shot out a prompt and eager hand. "Will you let me take it away to finish it by myself, Miss Brabazon?" "I don't think I can. I must look and see if there's anything more like that." "But it isn't your fault if there is. You've simply been inspired to write the truth." "But I feel almost ashamed." And the typewritten sheets rustled more than ever as she raised them up once more. But Delavoye jumped up and stood over her with a stiff lip. "Miss Brabazon, you really must let me read the rest of it to myself." "I must see first whether I can let anybody." "Let me see instead." Heaven knows how she construed his wheedling eagerness. There was a moment when they both had hold of the MS, when I felt that my friend was going too far, that his obstinate persistence could not fail to be resented as a liberty. But it was just at such moments that there was a smack of greatness about Uvo Delavoye. Given the stimulus, he could carry a thing off with a high hand and the light touch of a born leader. And so it must have been that he had Miss Julia coyly giggling when I fully expected her to stamp her foot. "You talk about our curiosity," she rallied him. "You men are just as bad." "I have a right to be curious," returned Uvo, in a tone that surprised me as much as hers. "You forget that your villain was once the head of our clan, and that so far the fact is quite unmistakable." "But that's just what I can't understand." "Yet the fact remains, Miss Brabazon, and I think it ought to count." "My dear young man, that's my only excuse for this very infliction," cried Miss Julia, with invincible jocosity. "If you'd rather it were destroyed, I shall be quite ready to destroy it, as Mr. Gillon knows. But I should like you to hear the whole of it first." And I could judge so much better if I read the rest to myself. And still he held his corner of the MS, and she hers, with an equal tenacity, which I believe to have been partly reflex and instinctive, but otherwise due to the discovery that she had written quite serenely about a blasphemer and an atheist, and not for a moment to any other qualm or apprehension whatsoever. And then, as I watched them, their eyes looked past me with one accord, the sheaf of fastened sheets fluttered to the ground between them, and I turned to behold the Vicar standing grim and gaunt upon the threshold, with a much younger and still more scandalised face peeping over his shoulder. "I didn't know that you were entertaining company," observed the Vicar, bowing coldly to us youths. "Are you aware that it's nearly midnight?" Miss Julia said she never could have believed it, but that she must have lost all sense of time, as she had been reading something to us. "I'm sure that was very kind, and has been much appreciated," said the Vicar, with his polar smile. "I suppose this was what you were reading?" And he was swooping down on the MS, but Delavoye was quicker, and quicker yet than either hand was the foot interposed like lightning by the Vicar. "You'll allow me?" he said, and so picked the crumpled sheets from under it. Uvo bowed, and the other returned the courtesy with ironic interest. In quivering tones Miss Julia began, "It's only something I've been—" "Considering for the parish magazine," ejaculated Uvo. "Miss Brabazon did me the honour of consulting me about it." "And may I ask your responsibility for the parish magazine, Mr. Delavoye?" "It's a story," continued Uvo, ignoring the question, and looking hard at Miss Julia. "A local story, evidently written for local publication, the scene being laid here at Witching Hill House. The principal character is the very black sheep of my family, who once lived there." "I am aware of the relationship," said the Vicar, dryly unimpressed. "It's not one that we boast about, hence Miss Brabazon's kindness in trying to ascertain whether my people or I were likely to object to its publication." "Well," said the Vicar, "I'm quite sure that neither you nor your people would have any objection to Miss Brabazon's getting to bed by midnight." He returned to the door, which he held wide open with urbane frigidity. "Now, Julia, if you'll set us an example." and at the door he remained when the bewildered lady, delivered from an embarrassment that she could not appreciate, and committed to a subterfuge in which she could see no point, had flown none the less readily, with a hectic simper and a whistle of silk. "Now, gentlemen," continued the Vicar, "it's nearly midnight, as I've said more than once." "I was to take the story with me to finish it by myself," explained Uvo, with the smile of a budding ambassador. "Oh, very well," rejoined the Vicar, shutting the door. "Then we must keep each other a minute longer. I happen myself to constitute the final court of appeal in all matters connected with the parish magazine. Moreover, Mr. Delavoye, I'm a little curious to see the kind of composition that merits a midnight discussion between my sister and two young men whose acquaintance I myself have had so little opportunity of cultivating." He dropped into a chair, merely waving us to do the same, and Delavoye did, but I remained standing, with my eyes on the reader's face, and I saw him begin where Miss Julia had left off and the MS had fallen open. I could not be mistaken about that. There was the mark of his own boot upon the page, but the Vicar read it without wincing at the passage which his sister had declared her intention of crossing out. His brows took a supercilious lift, his cold eyes may have grown a little harder as they read, and yet once or twice they lightened with a human relish, an icy twinkle, a gleam at least of something I had not thought to see in Mr. Brabazon. Perhaps I did not really see it now. If you look long enough at the Sphinx itself, in the end it will yield some semblance of an answering look. And I never took my eyes from the Vicar's granite features as typewritten sheet after sheet was turned so softly by his iron hand that it might have been some doctrinal pamphleteer who claimed his cool attention. When he had finished, he rose very quietly and put the whole MS behind the grate. Then I remembered that Delavoye also was in the room, and I signalled to him because the Vicar was stooping over the well-laid grate and striking matches. But Delavoye only shook his head and sat where he was when Mr. Brabazon turned and surveyed us both, with the firewood crackling behind his clerical tails. "Sorry to disappoint you, Mr. Delavoye," said he, "but I think you will agree that this is a case for the exercise of my powers in connection with our little magazine. The stupendous production now perishing in the flames was of course intended as a practical joke at our expense." "And I never saw it!" cried Uvo, scrambling to his feet. "Of course, if you come to think of it, that's the whole and only explanation. Isn't it, Gillon? A little dig at the Delavoyes as well, by the way." "Chiefly at us, I imagine," said the Vicar dryly. "I rather suspect that the very style of writing is an attempt at personal caricature. The taste is execrable all through, but that is only to be expected of the anonymous lampooner." "Was there really no name to it, Mr. Brabazon?" The question was asked for information, but Uvo's tone was that of righteous disgust. "No name at all, and one sheet of typewriting is exactly like another. My sister had not read it all herself, I gather?" "Evidently not, and she only read the first half to us." "Thank goodness for that!" cried the Vicar, off his guard. "The whole impertinence," he ran on more confidentially, "is so paltry, so vulgar, so egregiously badly done. It's all beneath contempt, and I shall not descend to the perpetrator's level by attempting to discover who he is. Neither shall I permit the matter to be mentioned again in my household, and as gentlemen I look to you both to resist the ventilation of a most ungentlemanly hoax." But the promise that we freely gave did not preclude us from returning at once to number 7, and there and then concocting a letter to Miss Julia, which I slipped into the letter box of the makeshift vicarage as the birds were waking in the wood behind Mulcaster Park. It was simply to say that Uvo was, after all, afraid that his kith and kin really might resent the publication of her thrilling but painful tale of their common ancestor, and therefore he had taken Miss Brabazon at her word, and the MS was no more. Its destruction was really demanded by the inexplicable fact that the story was the true story of a discreditable case in which the infamous Lord Mulcaster had actually figured, and the further fact that Miss Brabazon had nevertheless invented it, so far as she personally was aware, would have constituted another and still more interesting case for the Psychical Research Society, but for the aforesaid objections to its publication in any shape or form. All this made a document difficult to draw up, and none too convincing when drawn; but that was partly because the collaborators were already divided over every feature of the extraordinary affair, which indeed afforded food for argument for many a day to come. But in the meantime our dear Miss Julia accepted sentence and execution with a gentle and even a jocose resignation which made us both miserable. We did not even know that there had been any real occasion for the holocaust for which we claimed responsibility, or to what extent or lengths the unconscious plagiarism had proceeded. Delavoye, of course, took the view that coincided with his precious theory, whereas I argued from Mr. Brabazon's coolness that we had heard the worst. But the Vicar always was cool out of the pulpit, and it was almost a pity that we rewarded his moderation by going to church the next Sunday, for I never shall forget his ferocious sermon on the modern purveyor of pernicious literature. He might have been raving from bitter experience, as Delavoye of course declared he was. But there was one redeeming point in my recollection of his tirade, and that is a vivid and consoling vision of the elder Miss Brabazon listening with a rapt and unconscious serenity to every burning word. Chapter 5